Der Friede sei mit euch, o Lamm, das Opfer tilgte, der Menschheit schwere Schuld. Send uns auch deinen Frieden durch deine Gnade und Gut. Mein Heiland, Herr und Meister, o sprich erbarmungsreich, zu uns das Wort des Heiles, der Friede sei mit euch. Send uns den Himmelsfrieden, den nie die Erde gibt, der nur dem Herzen winket, das rein und treulich liebt.
It's very difficult to establish the exact number of Canadian Indigenous soldiers who fought in World War II. Only those whose native identity had been registered by the Canadian government were counted. These were the so-called status Indians, a word that we don't use today anymore. The official number in the Canadian records is around 3,000, but numerous non-status Indians, Métis and Inuit were not recorded as such. Some scholars believe that the actual number may have been as high as 8,000. Of those officially listed as Indigenous, the vast majority served in the Army branch. The Navy maintained a colour line until 1943, requiring that personnel be, and I quote, of pure European descent and of the white race. While a handful of Indigenous people did manage to get into the Navy, the numbers were very small and also remained low after 1943 when the colour line was lifted. The Air Force had the same racial restriction but changed its policy early on in the conflict. Still, few Indigenous soldiers joined. That's odd. Sorry. Okay. Most then served in the army. Today, more and more research is being conducted on Indigenous participation in the war. Nevertheless, our understanding of their experiences in the army and on the battlefields is still limited. Anecdotal evidence suggests that the soldiers were well respected by their comrades and encountered little racism. What they did encounter, however, were stereotypical views of them as Indians. From the start of Confederation in 1867 and the creation of the Indian Act, Canada's Indigenous peoples were viewed and treated as second-rate people. They were confined to reservations and reserves, which they were prohibited to leave without permission. They were forced to attend government schools and were forbidden to speak their languages and practice their culture. On the other side of the same coin, curiously enough, there are also the so-called positive stereotypes, such as the noble savage, the spiritually wise man or woman of nature, and that of the skillful warrior who could sneak up on the enemy without being seen, who could smell the enemy from miles away and have the courage of a lion. Although Indigenous peoples did have certain cultural skills, they were not, as people thought during the 1940s, innately, biologically equipped to perform well in the battlefield. Sadly, because of this romantic belief in the Indian as belonging to a race of great warriors, many Indigenous men ended up in the most dangerous of positions, or they felt forced to live up to this idealized view of them, took greater risks, and paid with their lives. What we do know for sure is that the position of Indigenous soldiers in the Canadian Army was better than the situation outside of the Army, either before the war or in the decades thereafter. Returning home after the war, racism, discrimination, and marginalization deeply impacted the veterans' lives and in many cases robbed them of their veterans' privileges and excluded them from the compensations that white veterans did receive. On a more positive note, veterans also contributed to the formation of new political organizations and helped further the cause of indigenous peoples through protests and petitions. By recognizing indigenous soldiers and by honoring them today for their great sacrifices and their services, we provide greater visibility to them as individuals and to the issues that continue to negatively influence Canadian indigenous lives in Canada today. In this military cemetery, we can visit the graves of at least 24, but probably more than 35 First Nations and Métis soldiers. They hail from very different areas in Canada, many from Ontario, but also from Manitoba, British Columbia, and other provinces. It's important to remember that they all belong to greatly diverse cultures and are not the same. We should honor them as human beings who gave their lives for freedom, and we should honor the identities that they had and the cultures they belong to. Hopefully, it will only be a matter of time before these graves, too, will be marked by the symbols that were recently instituted by the Canadian Armed Forces. The symbols will serve to visually identify the graves of Indigenous soldiers by adding the medicine wheel for First Nations and the infinity symbol for Métis people. In another step, traditional Indigenous names will be added. This is very important work. After all, it is essential that people be remembered for who they were, especially in death. Thank you.